Decades on this bench, and I thought I'd seen every pathetic iteration of human greed. I've seen liars who don't even have the decency to blink, and I've seen crocodile tears shed for the camera. But when case file 8940C hit my desk on that gray, unforgiving Tuesday, I felt a familiar, cold prickle at the base of my neck. This wasn't just a civil dispute. It was a litmus test for the soul. The courtroom was freezing, the kind of damp, biting cold that seeps into your bones and stays there. The doors swung open, and in walked Sarah Miller. She was 26, but her eyes held the exhaustion of a woman twice her age. Her coat was a thin, threadbare thing, the kind that offers no protection against the city wind. She didn't carry a briefcase. She carried a life in a beat-up bag, clutching it like an anchor. She didn't walk. She hovered, as if the slightest gust might shatter her into pieces. And then there was the plaintiff, Richard Sterling, CEO of Sterling Logistics. He strode in like he owned the floorboards, flanked by two attorneys whose suits cost more than Sarah's annual income. He didn't look around. He looked through us. He checked his gold watch, a piece that could buy a small car, and sighed, the sound of a man annoyed by the very existence of a court date. "Your Honor," his lead counsel began, voice oily and slick, "we are here to enforce a binding employment contract. Miss Miller breached her training agreement. She owes my client $5,000 for lost revenue and training costs." The room went silent. $5,000. To Sterling, that was pocket change for a lunch meeting. To the woman trembling at the defense table, that was the difference between survival and ruin. I looked at Sarah, then back at Sterling, who was already tapping impatiently on his phone. The arrogance was suffocating. He didn't see a human being in front of him. He saw a ledger entry, and he was about to learn that in my courtroom, humans aren't just figures on a spreadsheet. I leaned forward, the wood of the bench creaking under my grip. It was time to find out what kind of man really sat behind that expensive watch. I didn't wait for him to finish his dismissive, lawyer-scripted explanation. I slammed my hand on the bench, not out of anger, but to snap him out of his boardroom fantasy. "Mr. Sterling," I barked, my voice echoing off the wood panels, "put that phone away. You are in a court of law, not a shareholders' meeting. I'm asking you to explain in plain English why you are pursuing a woman who is visibly shaking in front of you." He sighed a long, dramatic exhale that signaled he was being inconvenienced by the truth. He pocketed his phone with the leisurely grace of a man who'd never worried about a rent payment in his life. "Judge, the law is the law," he started, his voice dripping with condescension. "We operate a high-volume logistics network. We have strict, documented training protocols. Miss Miller signed a contract. If she abandons her post during peak hours without authorization, she is liable for the replacement costs. She walked off the line on our single busiest day of the year. I run a business, not a charity. If I let this slide, how can I hold my other 500 employees accountable?" It was the kind of textbook, sterile logic that makes my blood boil. He was quoting policy, while a human life, a child's life, was hanging by a thread. He didn't see people. He saw assets and liabilities. The humanity had been engineered right out of his vocabulary. I turned my focus entirely to Sarah. "Miss Miller," I said, dropping the sharp edge from my voice. "Mr. Sterling says you abandoned your post. I want to hear your side. Why did you walk out?" Sarah's hands were trembling so badly that the bag on the table rattled. She reached in, her fingers clawing at the fabric, and pulled out a crumpled, stained document. She didn't speak immediately. She just held it out. Her eyes were wet, hollowed out by fear. "Your Honor," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry parchment. "I didn't want to quit. That job, it was everything. It paid for Emily's food, for our rent, for the medicine." She took a jagged breath, her gaze dropping to the floor. "My daughter Emily, she's 4 years old. She has acute leukemia. That morning, the school called. They told me she had collapsed. There was so much blood. It wouldn't stop." She looked up at me, her face a portrait of pure, unadulterated terror. "I called my manager. I called Mr. Sterling directly. I begged him. I told him I'd come back for the night shift, the weekend, anything. I just needed to get to her. I needed to be in that ambulance." The silence in the room wasn't just quiet, it was heavy, suffocating. Even Sterling's attorneys looked down at their documents. "Mr. Sterling," I said, and my voice carried that specific icy danger, a warning siren for anyone foolish enough to mistake my courtroom for a place where cruelty could be disguised as corporate policy. "Did you hear what she just said?" A 4-year-old child in the back of an ambulance, bleeding, and you were worried about a shift change? He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He simply tapped that pristine, leather-bound contract with a manicured fingernail. I heard her, Your Honor. And while it is an unfortunate situation, it is entirely irrelevant to the case at hand. Clause 4, Section B. Abandonment of duties during peak hours constitutes immediate termination and creates significant liability for company damages. Everyone has a difficult story. If I made exceptions for every personal crisis, my business would cease to function. She made a choice. That choice has a price. A chill snaked its way down my spine, settling deep in my chest. It wasn't just that he lacked empathy. Plenty of people in this world are just callous. It was something darker, something far more calculated. He had engineered empathy out of his operations entirely. He didn't just lack compassion, he considered it a liability. He was proud of his cruelty, branding it as operational efficiency. Let me understand this with crystal clarity, I said, leaning over the bench until my face was only feet from his, locking my eyes onto his cold, calculated stare. You are telling this court that when Miss Miller called you while her 4-year-old daughter was bleeding uncontrollably on the way to the ICU, your only response was that going to her child meant she was fired? I told her that leaving her post violated her contractual obligations, he corrected, his tone as mechanical as the machinery in his warehouses. In my view, that was a resignation. It is not my fault if she prioritizes her personal life over her professional commitment. Sarah let out a choked sob, a sound of pure, shattered reality that echoed against the high, marble walls of the courtroom. She wasn't just fighting for money, she was fighting for the right to be a mother. The gallery was silent. Even his own legal team seemed to shift uncomfortably, staring at their tablets as if they could disappear into the screens. He had said the quiet part out loud. To Richard Sterling, Sarah Miller wasn't a person. She was a unit of production, a replaceable cog that had failed to turn. And I was about to show him exactly what happens when the machine breaks down. Mr. Sterling, I continued, my voice low and dangerous, a warning tremor in the air. Everyone has a difficult story, you say? If you made exceptions, your company would stop functioning? I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor like a gavel strike. You are sitting there, talking about lost revenue, while a 4-year-old child is fighting for her life in an ICU. Do you have children, Mr. Sterling? He hesitated, his polished veneer finally showing a hairline crack. I have a son, boarding school, he's fine. That's not what I asked, I snapped. If your son were in that ambulance, bleeding, calling for you, and you were in a high-stakes board meeting, would you stay to finish your presentation, or would you burn this building to the ground to reach him? He looked away, his jaw tight. That's different. I own the company. I make the rules. She is an employee, a cog in the machine. Cogs don't decide when the machine stops. A gasp swept through the gallery. Even his high-priced lawyers looked like they wanted the floor to swallow them whole. He'd said the quiet part out loud, the ugly, dehumanizing truth of his management style. I looked at Sarah. She wasn't just crying anymore. She was staring at him, realizing that in his eyes, she had never been a person at all. Mr. Sterling, I said, a strange, terrifying calm settling over the room. In this courtroom, we don't deal with cogs. We deal with human beings. And you, sir, seem to have lost track of the distinction. You came in here believing this was an arithmetic problem. Breach plus damages equals payment. You made a fundamental error in your calculation. You assumed the law was indifferent to cruelty. You assumed justice was a machine the wealthy could operate for their own purposes. I glanced at Quinn, my bailiff. The file on Sterling Logistics labor violations, the one we pulled from the state archives this morning. Bring it here. The color drained from Sterling's face. The smirk was gone, replaced by the pallor of a man who realized the ground was crumbling beneath his Italian leather shoes. He thought he was untouchable. He thought this was just a balance sheet transaction. He had no idea what he had walked into. As Quinn handed me the folder, the silence was absolute, a vacuum waiting to be filled by the truth. I didn't wait for a response. I turned to my bailiff, Quinn, my eyes never leaving Sterling. Quinn, the file on Sterling Logistics labor violations, the one we pulled from the state archives this morning. Bring it here. The color drained from Sterling's face instantly. The smirk that had defined his expression all morning vanished, replaced by a pasty, sweating panic. He hadn't counted on me doing my homework. He thought I was just another bureaucrat in a robe who would rubber stamp his contract. He was dead wrong. The folder landed on my desk with a heavy final thud. In that cavernous, silent courtroom, It sounded exactly like a gunshot. You didn't imagine I would walk into this hearing unprepared, did you, Mr. Sterling? I asked, my voice deadly quiet. You think you're the first predator to cross my path? You're not. And you certainly won't be the last. I opened the file. May 2021. An employee terminated for time theft because he took 10 extra minutes to inject insulin. August 2021. A pregnant woman fired 2 weeks before her maternity leave, only to be replaced 3 days later by a cheaper hire. And last month, deducting uniform costs from final paychecks and forcing wages below the federal minimum. You call this a business model? I call it a predation model. The gallery erupted in a low, collective murmur of disgust. Sterling turned, his eyes darting around the room, realizing he had lost the control he cherished so much. I employ thousands of people, he barked, his voice straining. I fuel this state's economy. You're cherry-picking disgruntled individuals to misrepresent how I run my operations. This is standard industry practice. Standard? I repeated, leaning forward, the fire in my eyes burning hot enough to singe his expensive suit. Is it standard to treat human beings like batteries? To drain them of every ounce of productivity and then discard them the moment they stop producing? Is that the industry standard for garbage or for people? I turned to Sarah, my expression softening slightly. Miss Miller, were you aware of these practices before you signed on? Your Honor, we were terrified, she whispered, her voice trembling. There is a sign in the break room. If you do not want to be here, there are 10 people waiting outside for your position. They timed our bathroom breaks. More than 3 minutes was a recorded violation. 3 violations, and you're fired. The day Emily became ill, I was already carrying 2 violations. I had taken a call from her oncologist the week before. The courtroom went from silent to unnaturally still. The hatred in the room for Sterling was palpable, a physical weight hanging in the air. He hadn't just fired a desperate mother, he had presided over a system designed to crush the vulnerable into dust. Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a razor, you are suing this woman for $5,000. Under what specific legal basis do you justify this amount as training costs? His lead attorney, now visibly sweating, shuffled through a stack of papers, desperately trying to find a footing. It's a standard administrative fee, Your Honor. Onboarding, safety instruction, human resources overhead. Did she return her uniform? I cut in, looking directly at Sarah. Yes, Your Honor, Sarah answered, her voice trembling but clear. I washed it and brought it back the very next day. So, you are charging her a flat, non-negotiable penalty disguised as a training fee, I said, turning my gaze back to the lawyer. In this state, liquidated damages clauses are legally unenforceable if they function as a punishment rather than a reasonable estimate of actual loss. Mr. Sterling, how long was this training that warrants a $5,000 debt? Sarah spoke up again. It was a 4-hour video, Your Honor, a grainy safety tape from the 1990s that we watched in the break room. Then they handed me a vest and put me on the line. That was it. The gallery let out a collective, audible scoff. A 4-hour video? That was his massive investment? 4 hours, I repeated, letting the absurdity sink into the rafters of the courtroom. This isn't a training fee, Mr. Sterling. This is a trap. You lure people into employment, force them to sign a predatory document for an amount they cannot possibly afford, and then, the moment they try to leave a toxic environment, you hold that debt over their heads like a guillotine. This is indentured servitude with a corporate logo. I picked up the phone on my desk and hit the speaker button. Who are you calling? Sterling demanded, his voice finally losing that polished, arrogant sheen. He was starting to fray at the edges. The Department of Labor and Training, I said, staring him down. And after that, the Attorney General's office. Because what I'm looking at isn't a civil contract dispute anymore. It's a pattern of systemic fraud and illegal wage theft. His lawyer shot to his feet, eyes wide. Your Honor, we move to dismiss with prejudice. We withdraw the suit immediately. Now you want to withdraw? I said, not lifting my finger from the line. Now that the light is on, you want to scurry back into the shadows? Too late, counselor. I looked at Sterling. He was a man who had built a kingdom on the backs of people he deemed cogs. Now, the machine he loved so much was grinding to a halt. Sit down. You aren't going anywhere. You brought this case into my courtroom, and you are going to see it through to the end, or I will ensure you see it through from a jail cell tonight. I will not call the Labor Department at this moment because I have an alternative in mind, I said, my voice cutting through the panicked atmosphere of the courtroom like a razor. One that is going to cost you something considerably more meaningful than a phone call to your accountants. It is going to require you to go somewhere you have never been, and to look at something you have spent your entire career insulating yourself from. Sterling looked as if I had physically struck him. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking smaller, grayer. What do you mean?" he stammered. The boardroom authority completely evaporated. "You have two options, Mr. Sterling." "Listen very, very carefully," I leaned in, my gaze locking onto his, forcing him to witness the contempt in my eyes. "Behind door 1, I refer every single piece of evidence I have heard today to federal prosecutors. Your company comes under a full-scale criminal investigation. Your name will appear on a Department of Justice filing alongside words like wage theft, fraud, and conspiracy. You will watch your empire dismantle itself, piece by agonizing piece, while you sit in a holding cell wondering where your efficiency went." The silence that followed was suffocating. His lawyers were motionless, trapped by the weight of what was happening. "Behind door 2, I continued, my voice steady and relentless, "you accompany my bailiff Quinn to Hasbro Children's Hospital right now. You walk into that oncology ward. You sit in the plastic, uncomfortable chair next to Emily Miller's bed, and you stay there. You stay there until you understand, genuinely understand what you actually took from this family when you decided that a few dollars was worth more than a mother's peace of mind. You will see the reality you tried to price out of existence. You will see what abandonment actually looks like." Sterling looked between his counsel and the door, his face a mask of disbelief and pure, unadulterated fear. "You can't do this. I have a business to run. I have a life." "You had a business, Mr. Sterling," I snapped. "Now, you have a conscience to find. Quinn, take him. If he tries to run, if he tries to call his lawyers, or if he spends 1 second on that phone, drag him back here, and I will personally see to it that he spends the night in a cell." He stood up, his legs visibly shaky, and followed Quinn toward the back door of the courtroom. For the first time in his life, Richard Sterling wasn't a CEO. He was just a small man, shivering as he faced the reality he had spent years trying to build a wall against. 6 months later, I convened the follow-up hearing. When Richard Sterling walked into my courtroom this time, the transformation was jarring. The Italian silk suit was gone, replaced by a modest, unremarkable dark blazer. The arrogance that used to radiate off him like heat from a furnace had been replaced by a quiet, haunted humility. He didn't check his watch. He didn't scroll on his phone. He stood with his hands at his sides, waiting. Beside him stood Sarah Miller. She looked like a different woman, entirely rosy-cheeked, posture upright, eyes clear of that hollow, desperate exhaustion. "Your Honor," Sterling began, his voice devoid of the boardroom roar that had once filled this room. "I am here to report on my commitment." He placed a folder on the bench, not filled with legal threats, but with receipts and medical records. "Emily's total treatment costs to date have reached $452,000. We transferred her to the specialist center in Boston for advanced therapy. All travel and housing for the family have been covered in full. More importantly, we have abolished the penalty clause. We created the Emily Fund. 5% of quarterly profits now go to emergency assistance for any employee facing a family crisis. No one will ever be terminated again for caring for a loved one. That time is now paid leave." A murmur rippled through the gallery. I leaned back, looking at him over my spectacles. "You know that reduces your profit margins, Mr. Sterling. What do your shareholders say?" He smiled a genuine, tired smile. "Net profit dropped 12% last quarter, Your Honor. But turnover? It hit 0. Productivity is up 20%, and for the first time in 10 years, I sleep through the night without medication. I'll take that trade." Sarah stood then, her voice bright. "When Mr. Sterling first came to that hospital, I thought it was just a performance. But he came back every weekend. He didn't just pay the bills. He sat with Emily so I could sleep. She calls him Uncle Rich. He saved my daughter's life in every sense of the word." Then, the courtroom doors opened. A small girl, wearing a bright pink beanie to cover the effects of the treatment, walked down the center aisle, holding my bailiff Quinn's hand. The room went reverent. She walked straight to the front, fragile and brave, and looked up at Sterling. "Hi, Uncle Rich." "Hi, Emily. You look strong today." "I am. The doctor says my white blood cells are fighting like ninjas." I had to take a moment. I cleared my throat, pulling a tissue from my desk. In all my years, I've received John's 8 awards and accolades, but nothing carried the weight of the drawing she handed to me. It was done in the gold ink of the pen Sterling had given her 3 stick figures under a bright sun: Emily, Sarah, and a figure in a tie carrying a bag. "That's Uncle Rich," she said, pointing to the tie. "He's carrying my medicine." And in the clouds, a small black-robed figure. "And that's you," she said. "You're watching." I looked at the drawing, then out at the room. People say character is formed over a lifetime and cannot be cracked open in a single afternoon. After 40 years on this bench, I used to believe that too. Richard Sterling proved me wrong. He proved that even the most armored heart can be reached if the right moment finds it. I framed that drawing. It is, and always will be, the finest evidence I have ever received.